I've been thinking about doing this idea for this account for ranking like what movies were actually successful for Walt Disney and which ones were failures. And you'll be surprised from the results. So today I'm just going to be talking about the failures that Walt Disney made when he was alive, obviously, or in product like knew about when he before he passed and his production staff. Believe it or not, the first one on my list is actually Pinocchio. You probably wouldn't expect Pinocchio to be a flop, but it actually was. It underperformed for Walt Disney, and he had to eventually do more budget cuts on his more of his movies because of Pinocchio. Like it underperformed. He put a bigger budget in it, and he ended up not getting much for his dime or quarter for it. Well, not dime or quarter, obviously a lot more than that, but obviously, and also wartime was coming up, so that's also going to put pressure on the movies he makes going on. But yeah, even though Pinocchio is way more popular now, he was not popular during that time. Only the books that released 40 years earlier made him popular at that time, and people thought that the movie was not as well adapted for a movie, or the book wasn't. It also took a little bit of time for the movie to actually get awards, like 44, 45, 46. Those were the years that it got awards because it got re-released into theaters. So that's why it did so good then, but when it released in 1937, it didn't do that hot. Okay, now this one might not be much of a surprise, but Dumbo. Like Dumbo actually took like less than $1 million in budget to make for our standards, I guess. And the movie only made a little over $1 million, so it wasn't much of a profit. And this is during wartime, like 1941, that literally purged some of Walt Disney's staff, and this movie didn't make that much money. Like it was on a budget as well. Like Pinocchio had over $1 million put into budget, and it made not as much money at first, but this didn't make it barely any money at all. And people were just not interested with the plot as much, so they didn't want to go see it. But they made a live action one, and that one also didn't do well, obviously, in recent times. Which, if you make a remake of a bad movie, I don't think, or not a bad movie, I enjoy Dumbo, but like the critics at the time didn't. So if you make a remake of a movie that critics didn't like, or the movie was underwhelming to some people, they're not gonna enjoy it either. On this next one, you're going to have to stay with me. Fantasia. Okay, it didn't do well initially, but over time, it actually did pretty good with all the expansions and the more releases it got. So it got so much money. It became the 23rd highest grossing American film well, with adjustion to inflation anyway. But it wasn't like that when the first released, because it only sold like 600,000 over the successful Disney movies when he was alive that sold over millions, hundreds of millions. Some of them have. So this movie was not something special at first, but the more like expansions to the movie they released, or I guess theatrical musical type film, the more it got more praise and the more people saw it and the more money it made. So eventually he made his money back on the first production of it, which is great. But it was also during wartime, so that's why it didn't do well at first. A lot of people are not going to like this, though. Alice in Wonderland is actually on this list. It actually didn't perform very well. It actually lost money during production. Even with with its re-release that was in the 70s, it didn't only made a little bit more back. It didn't do very well, even though the movie was like highly praised by critics. They claim that the movie also, even though it was pretty good, was written by so many directors, so it felt like there was so much going on in the movie at a time. So that's why they didn't do very well. That's what they claim. And the movie just didn't make that much money back. It didn't make its money back. And the movie, I liked it when I was a kid. I watched it, but I don't know. Like they made John Burton reboots too, and the first reboot actually did very well, the first movie, but Looking Through the Hourglass didn't do so well, which is why they haven't made one since. And I think the only reason that movie did good was Johnny Depp was in it. And the book released 100 years before the movie was released, pretty much, or almost 100. It was like 90 years. And the movie was way different than the book critics said, so that's also probably another reason why it didn't do as well, because the book was a top-selling book at that time. And still, I think, not sure, it might not be anymore, but Pinocchio is. That book is still sold a lot, believe it or not. The next movie is Sleeping Beauty, which gave us Maleficent, of course. I forget what the princess's name is. I think it's Aurora, yeah. And in Sleeping Beauty, the whole thing is, like, the movie didn't do so well at first. It was a box office bomb. It took nearly a decade to make the movie because of wartime. And eventually, after the movie was released, it took so much money that they had to do layoffs. And so many layoffs, in fact, that, like, the studio almost had a problem with making more movies after that. But they ended up recouping their costs with another couple movies. Pretty sure one of them was 101 Dalmatians. That movie recouped a lot of the costs, and so did Peter Pan. I'll talk about that in a Disney's successes video. But right now we're doing the failure video. Next movie, this is actually a time thing, literally, because at the time it was a failure, but like after wartime was over, it was not much of a failure after it kept getting more re-releases, is Bambi. Literally, his brother, Walt Disney's brother, had to telegram him and tell him, or not telegram, I think he was a phone call, but he literally had to tell him that the movie underperformed and the movie didn't make as much as they hoped, like within the first few weeks. And eventually, a couple or 3 years later, it did end up recouping the costs because they left the movie in the theater for like a couple or 3 years. I forget how many years, but they ended up leaving it there, and it ended up recouping all the costs back. It ended up becoming the third best-selling movie for Disney at that time. But like 5 years after that, it did that, but it was a failure at first because it didn't exceed expectations at first. And the last film on this list is actually The Sword in the Stone, which I personally loved this movie as a kid. I had the VHS tape. Even though DVDs were possible at the time, I had a VHS. I'm only like 21, 20. I'm going to be 22 in August, but I had the VHS tape, and I'd watch it over and over again. The reason why this movie failed is they didn't market it enough. This is the movie with like Merlin and King Arthur getting the sword out of the stone and the magic fight that happens in the movie. But the reason it didn't do well, they just didn't market it as much, and critics didn't give it a good review. It didn't sell as high as any of the Disney movies. In fact, a lot of these Disney movies that are failures, were considered failures at first, or failures in general, have made more money than this. Except maybe, I'm trying to think, Dumbo or Alice in Wonderland probably didn't make more money than this. Other than that, all the other ones have probably made more money than this one, which is crazy. But yeah, they just didn't market it as much, and you like see Merlin a lot and other stuff, so I'm happy they still use him. Well, that was the Disney movies that were failures when Walt Disney was around and alive to be directing and producing these movies. See you guys for the next video.